If the schizophrenic patient does not recover, he may deteriorate as time goes on. There's a characteristic lack of interest in the environment, withdrawal from contact with others, and with it goes an increasing loss of emotional response. These people become vague and empty. Their manner is childish and they are gawky. They show little or no initiative and spontaneity. If they do react emotionally, their reaction is often inappropriate. They have, of course, no real plans for the future.
In 1959, psychologist Milton Rokeach brought together 3 men with schizophrenia, who all believed they were Jesus Christ. He hoped to cure their delusions by prompting them to question their identities as God's only son. What ensued was a 2-year experiment to see if he could get them to change their beliefs, all while employing questionable methods for the sake of academic curiosity. Because so few experiments like the one Dr. Rokeach was proposing had been carried out, for ethical reasons, nobody was really sure what to expect. They figured that bringing together multiple people who were all claiming to be the same person couldn't last, especially in a controlled environment where the men would be forced to confront themselves and their delusions. Eventually, something would have to give, right? The question was, what exactly? Would the men return to reality, or retreat even further into their delusion? I'm Brooke, and this is Armchair Investigator. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the controversial experiment carried out by social psychologist Dr. Milton Rokeach. On July 1, 1953, 3 men met for the first time in Ward D23 of Ypsilanti State Hospital in Michigan. The goal? To explore the way their delusional beliefs and behaviors might change once they were confronted with the ultimate contradiction: having multiple people claim the same identity. Dr. Rokeach set out to investigate human personality, identity, and the beliefs that people hold. How do we develop beliefs and what functions do they serve? Why are some people more open with their beliefs and willing to change them while others are rigid and closed off? What kind of circumstances could get a person to change their beliefs? And how might that look? Does it change gradually or all at once? Dr. Rokeach's experiment was based on 3 assumptions. The first being that not all the beliefs a person holds are of equal importance to them. The second being that the more central a belief, the more it will resist change. And finally, that if a core belief is changed, it will affect the entire belief system as a whole. A person's core beliefs represent the basic truths they hold about themselves, their physical reality, and their social reality. A person's beliefs are shaped not only by their individual experiences, but by others around them that have had similar experiences and ways of thinking. Dr. Rokeach makes the example, I believe this is a table because I've been told it's a table, and others around me agree it's a table. Then there are non-core beliefs. These beliefs can be divided into 3 groups. That is, beliefs about authority figures, beliefs learned from authority figures, and inconsequential beliefs. Rokeach theorized that non-core beliefs should be easier to change than core beliefs, and he categorized belief in God as a non-core belief. By bringing the 3 Christs together, Dr. Rokeach reasoned that each of the men would be forced to confront 2 beliefs that they all held: a delusional belief about who they were and a realistic belief that only one person can have a given identity. Because Dr. Rokeach's experiment couldn't exactly be carried out on healthy, functioning individuals, he primarily focused on the delusional beliefs of his patients, hoping that subjecting their beliefs to a little bit of pressure and strain would result in little harm and a great deal gained. He and his research team hoped that the experiment would yield significant scientific results and improve the mental state of the patients involved. After securing a research grant, the team surveyed 25,000 patients at mental hospitals in Michigan. They found 1 patient in Kalamazoo and 2 more at Ypsilanti State Hospital. Dr. Rokeach then arranged to have the Kalamazoo Christ transferred to Ypsilanti. The 3 men were Clyde Benson, Joseph Castle, and Leon Gabor. Of course, those aren't their real names. Their names had been changed in order to protect their privacy. The men were told that they would be working together for the next few months in hopes of gaining a better understanding of themselves. All agreed to have their sessions tape recorded. Clyde Benson came from a hard-working, well-respected family. His father was a farmer and carpenter, and while those who knew him said he was generally a good person, he was known to have a temper. Clyde's mother was anxious and deeply religious. By the time she had conceived Clyde, she had had several miscarriages, resulting in her being overprotective of her son. At 24 years old, Clyde married the daughter of a wealthy farmer. For the first 10 years of their marriage, they lived with Clyde's parents. Then, for the next 5 years, they lived on a rented farm just 3 miles away. Eventually, with his father-in-law's help, Clyde bought a farm of his own. It was during Clyde's 18th year of marriage that things began to fall apart as tragedy after tragedy struck his family. His wife Shirley had died, leaving Clyde, who was 42, alone to raise 3 daughters. A few months later, his father died, followed shortly after by his father-in-law. It wasn't long after that Clyde's oldest daughter married and moved away. Then Clyde's mother passed. By this point, Clyde was drinking heavily. In 1934, Clyde remarried. His 2 remaining daughters went to stay with their maternal grandmother, while he moved to his new wife's farm. Alma and Clyde had a few children of their own, all while Clyde continued drinking heavily, even going as far as to sell furniture, livestock, and land in order to fund his habit. By 1941, his second wife Alma had filed for divorce. It wasn't until 1942, when Clyde was sent to jail, that others began to see just how bad his mental state was. One minute he was ranting, the next he was praying. He claimed to be God in Christ and said that he could hear his first wife's voice coming from an airplane. Clyde's newfound interest in religion surprised his family, since he had never really been religious. It was shortly after the jail incident that he was committed to a mental hospital, and by age 53, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. A diagnosis that was hard for Clyde's family to wrap their minds around. His daughter said that growing up, he was a devoted father who often played with them. In fact, to them, he never really grew up and often had a difficult time making decisions on his own. Clyde was also known to be moody and had an uncontrollable temper, though between his mother and his wife, they were able to keep him in check. The only time he seemed to show mental instability was shortly after Shirley's death. The second patient involved in the experiment was Joseph Castle. He was the first of 9 children born in Quebec, Canada. Joseph's early years were said to be quite normal, though those close to the family said that Joseph's father was abusive and cruel to his wife and children, leading Joseph to develop an intense fear of his father. His outlet was school, and Joseph was a good student who had a deep passion for English literature. Once he finished the 8th grade, his father got him a job working in a grocery store. Although his entire family attended church, none of them were particularly religious. At 16, Joseph's mother died, and not long after, he went to live with his grandmother. As a young man, Joseph immigrated to Detroit in hopes of getting a good job in order to further his education and travel. Joseph wanted more than anything to be a writer, and he read anything he could get his hands on. History books, biographies, novels, you name it. At 24, he married a woman named Beatrice. But Joseph found it difficult to get close to others, and intimacy was hard for him. He didn't want to be touched, and there were strict rituals that had to be followed in order for any intimacy to happen. Mainly, Beatrice and all their bedding had to be cleaned prior. Those who knew Joseph said he preferred reading to having a social life. At parties, he could often be found in the bedrooms poring over books. He was described as serious and lacking any sense of humor. Joseph felt that he was smarter than his friends, and because none of them shared his interests, he often felt isolated. As time went on, he withdrew more and more into himself. Joseph worked as a clerk up until he was hospitalized, a job that he hated. It made him feel like a servant, and he didn't like having to talk to customers. Despite not wanting children, he and Beatrice would go on to have 3 daughters. With the birth of their second daughter in 1935, Joseph asked, where'd she come from, accusing Beatrice of having an affair. 2 years later, when their third daughter was born, he asked the same question. Writing was Joseph's passion. It was all he wanted to do. He tried over and over to get Beatrice to take a job outside of the home so that he could quit his job and focus on writing, an idea that his wife firmly shut down, saying that it was his responsibility to earn a living and provide for the family. In the summer of 1938, things took a turn for Joseph and his mental health. The car he had been driving was about to crash into another vehicle. Rather than take measures to avoid a collision altogether, Joseph turned off his ignition for fear of it catching on fire. Everyone except Joseph was badly injured. His family believed that the medical bills, worry, and guilt weighed heavily on him, contributing to his mental decline. The accident happened in the summer of 1938, and by October, Joseph had quit his job and refused to get another, insisting that working made him ill. At Joseph's urging, the family sold their house and furniture and moved in with Beatrice's family in Canada, something her family didn't take too kindly to, strongly urging Joseph to do the right thing and get a job. This is around the time that he began to believe that people were poisoning his food. In March of 1939, he was committed to a hospital in Canada, and Beatrice returned to Detroit. Joseph was eventually deported back to Michigan and sent to Ypsilanti State Hospital, where he received his diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, just like Clyde. Though Joseph's delusions about being God didn't come about until around 10 years after he was hospitalized. Despite their father's harsh personality and ways of thinking, Joseph's children remember him as a gentle man who always had a piece of candy and a bedtime story for them growing up. The third patient involved in the experiment was Leon Gabor, who, perhaps out of all of the men, had the most difficult childhood. His parents divorced just a few years after he was born, leaving Leon's mother, Mary, to raise 2 boys on her own. It sounds like his mother may have also suffered with mental health issues of her own, as she was described as a religious fanatic who claimed to hear voices. The priest of the church she belonged to said that Mary spent too much time at church, and he was concerned that her sons weren't being taken care of. And he was right. Mary was never home to cook or clean the house. The boys often survived on crackers and were told to stay huddled together in bed during the winter because their house didn't have any heat. Leon was sent to a parochial school where he excelled and was considered an above-average student. Instead of going to high school, he was sent to a pre-seminary school in another state, but for reasons unknown was expelled when he was 17. After returning home, he worked odd jobs before finally landing work as an industrial electrician. His mother quit working and spent all of her time at the church. Eventually, Leon volunteered for the Army. During his 3 years with them, he earned 4 ribbons and 4 combat stars for his exposure to enemy fire. In 1945, he received honorable discharge as a private first class. After his time in the Army, Leon's mother said he was an entirely different person, one who no longer listened to her. Leon went back to work as an electrician, and in 1948 started taking college classes. At that time, his VA advisor described him as a veteran who appears sincere, cooperative, ambitious, expressive, and emotionally stable. Despite excelling in primary school, college seemed to be a different beast altogether for Leon. He ended up dropping 2 out of 3 of his classes, effectively ending his educational career forever. By 1950, Leon's continual absenteeism at work began, and by 1953, he was complaining to the VA about chronic exhaustion and spine pain. Doctors diagnosed him with chronic fatigue syndrome. Then he began hearing voices that told him he was God. A year later, in April of 1954, he was committed and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, just like Clyde and Joseph. During their first session with Dr. Rokeach, the men were asked to go around and introduce themselves. Dr. Rokeach went first, followed by his research assistant. Then Joseph introduced himself. By this point, Joseph was 58 and had been hospitalized for nearly 20 years. He was of medium height and build, bald, and missing half of his front teeth. After Joseph had introduced himself, Dr. Rokeach asked if there was anything else he wanted to say, to which Joseph replied, "Yes, I'm God." Clyde introduced himself next. He was 70 and had been hospitalized for 17 years. When Dr. Rokeach asked if he had any names other than Clyde, Clyde said, "Well, I have other names, but that's my vital side, and I made God 5 and Jesus 6. Leon was last to introduce himself. Of the 3, he looked the most like Jesus. He was tall, lean, and often walked with his hands held out in front of him, palms facing up. He was 38 and had been hospitalized for 5 years. Leon started his introduction stating that not only did his birth certificate state that he was Lord of Lords and King of Kings, but it also stated that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. That's when Joseph chimed in, "He says he's the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. I can't get it. I know who I am. I'm God, Christ, the Holy Ghost. And if I wasn't, by gosh, I wouldn't claim to be anything of the sort. I'm Christ." Then Clyde spoke out, "I represent the resurrection. I'm the same as Jesus." As the men bickered back and forth about who was really Jesus, Leon stated that he wouldn't be attending any more of their meetings, claiming that they were mental torture. Now, before conducting this experiment, Dr. Rokeach had decided that he wasn't going to force the men to do anything against their will, even if it meant abandoning the research project altogether. He hoped that Leon would change his mind. And as the first session drew to a close, he was surprised to see that the three Christs didn't seem all that upset over their initial encounter with one another. So, how did the men perceive one another's claims? Well, Clyde explained it away by saying that Joseph and Leon weren't really alive, stating, "The machines in them are talking. Take the machines out of them and they won't talk. You can't kill the ones with machines. They're dead already." Clyde theorized that someone named Nellie had shot Leon, and that Joseph had been killed by his wife. Clyde believed the machines were located to the right of the men's stomachs. When Dr. Rokeach asked Joseph to take off his shirt and let Clyde feel around for the machine, Joseph agreed. When Clyde couldn't find it, he said, "That's funny, it isn't here. It must have slipped down to where you can't feel it." Joseph insisted that Clyde and Leon couldn't be God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit, saying, "I'm the only God. Clyde and Leon are patients at a mental hospital, and their being patients here proves they're insane." Leon believed Clyde and Joseph were instruments of God, and that they were claiming to be God to gain prestige. When Dr. Rokeach asked the men why they were in the hospital, Clyde claimed that he owned it, as well as the adjacent properties, and it was his job to look after them. Joseph sometimes said that he was sick in the head, but not insane. Other times he said that the hospital was an English stronghold, and it was his responsibility to protect them. Leon said the reason he was in a mental hospital was due to prejudice, jealousy, and duping. Other times he said that his uncle, Michael the Archangel, sent him to the hospital to investigate the conditions there. When Dr. Rokeach asked them why they thought he had brought them all together, Clyde was the only one who couldn't answer the question. Joseph said it was so they could iron out that he was the one and only God, and that Dr. Rokeach wanted Joseph's help in convincing Clyde and Leon that they were crazy. Leon believed that they were being brainwashed and pitted against each other, and he wasn't completely wrong. Dr. Rokeach said that while all three were superficially aware of being in a mental hospital, none of them had even the vaguest insight into the meaning of their situation. Leon was the only one who could grasp the purpose of the research project in reasonably realistic terms, that they had come together to agitate one against the other for the purpose of trying to alter their beliefs. Not surprisingly, all three men were able to explain away the other's claims of being God. To Dr. Rokeach, this demonstrated that even though they were psychotic, they still processed things the way most people do. They perceived the situation, both at a personal and social level. They were affected by the interaction, attempted to understand it, and thought about it, and formulated a way to explain it. During the first 2 weeks of the experiment, the men argued daily over their identity. On the surface, it appeared to Dr. Rokeach that they were trying to persuade each other and impress onlookers, showing that they were reasonable men who could talk things over. But as the weeks went on, their arguments got even more heated. The men shifted from trying to persuade one another about who was really Jesus to having hostile outbursts. And unlike Clyde, Joseph and Leon paid attention to what the other was saying and doing, and they used it against each other. For instance, Leon saw Joseph tear down a notice for church service and used it against him in an argument. The first show of physical violence took place 3 weeks after their initial meeting, on July 22nd, when the men began talking about Adam and Eve. Adam was a colored man, Leon stated, because his body was taken from the rich brown mud. Did you know that? Woman Eve was a mulatto, because she was taken from his rib, and rib meat is a little bit lighter. Adam was white. I made the passing of that at 1 year old, Clyde said. Things quickly escalated when Leon challenged Clyde back, saying that Adam was his foster brother, so he knew the truth. That's when Clyde stood up and hit Leon in the face. Dr. Rokeach and one of his assistants pulled the two men apart. A few days later, when Dr. Rokeach revisited the confrontation with Leon, he was surprised to hear Leon say that he deserved what he got from Clyde. Throughout the entire experiment, there were only 3 incidents of violence among them. The first between Clyde and Leon, the next between Joseph and Leon, and the last between Clyde and Joseph. The research team felt that all 3 men wanted to avoid any further physical altercations, and while they did argue, the men never let it escalate beyond that. Of the three Christs, Clyde was the least in touch with social reality and the most childlike. He also participated the least in group discussions. His typical defense was denial, including denying that the other two were alive. When he did assert himself, it typically went something like this. You're going to listen to the truth. I'm the Jesus, and you're going to follow. I'm the boss. You better believe it. You serve me first. Although Joseph appeared to be more aware than Clyde, some of his go-to responses also involved denial. Another one of his defenses was withdrawal, and as time went on, he used it more and more. He came to meetings armed with books and magazines. Other times he sat smoking cigarettes, staring off into space. During their August 31st meeting, he left the room 6 times. Dr. Rokeach also noticed that as the men's arguments got more and more heated, Joseph's behavior became more bizarre. Despite it being a hot summer, he often came to meetings wearing 3 pairs of socks. He even began putting towels and loaves of bread in the toilet, and tossed magazines and books out the window. Out of the 3 of them, Clyde enjoyed and looked forward to their daily meetings the most. He admired the men for their intelligence and was content just sitting back and listening. Joseph said he didn't mind the meetings either. He felt it gave them a chance to, quote, iron out the hostility, telling Dr. Rokeach, if you keep ironing out like this, in time there's nothing left for the opposition about what I am, God. They won't believe they're God. They'll believe they're just mortals. They will believe that I am God. Then I'll be able to do my work better. Leon got along better with Clyde than Joseph. In fact, he became somewhat protective of Clyde and often tried to find common ground with him. When it came to how the men felt about Dr. Rokeach, they all differed. Clyde felt that he was the one in charge, not the doctor. He also never addressed Dr. Rokeach by name, leading Dr. Rokeach to suspect it was because Clyde didn't know it. Joseph liked Dr. Rokeach and often felt protected by him. He believed the doctor was there, as Joseph liked to say, to iron things out, while Leon appeared to be the most guarded with him. Despite all of the hostility, tension, and claims that they weren't too fond of one another, there were times when they had positive encounters together. And the research team noticed that even outside of the meetings, the men often sat near each other, even though they didn't have to. And while the 3 men barely spoke to each other during rec time, they were often seen sharing and borrowing items, things like tobacco, cigarette paper, and fruit. Joseph even began to believe that Leon and Clyde were there to help protect the stronghold. Leon claimed to be able to perform miracles. Not only that, he could bilocate, that is, be in 2 places at once, as well as translocate, go from one place to another instantaneously. During one meeting, he announced that he could command a table to lift itself off the floor. He picked out a large table, turned his back to it, and in a loud, affirmative tone, commanded it to lift itself. When Dr. Rokeach announced that he didn't see the table lifting, Leon sighed and said it was because the doctor couldn't see cosmic reality. Clyde, too, insisted that he possessed special powers, believing he could walk through walls. He also claimed that he both made the Bible and was the Bible, and often talked about how his spirit stayed around the water in Palestine. Joseph not only claimed to be God, but other important figures throughout the world as well. One day he said he was the governor of Illinois. Dr. Rokeach asked, "Are you the governor of Illinois or God?" To which Joseph said he was both, reminding Dr. Rokeach that God, too, had to earn a living. During another meeting, Dr. Rokeach asked the men to tell him about their mothers. Joseph was the first to respond. And despite the fact that Joseph's mother had long since passed, he told Dr. Rokeach that his mother was about 63 and had arthritis, making it difficult for her to walk. Clyde said he had a good mother, but she was no longer alive, stating that when she had been, she was quite religious, was a good cook, and kept a wonderful home. Leon claimed he had no mother, that he disowned her after finding out that she tried to have him electronically killed while giving birth to him. He also claimed that there were multiple times she tried to poison him with arsenic. When Dr. Rokeach asked them to tell him about their fathers, Joseph claimed that his was still alive and wrote to him on occasion. There were also times that Joseph said he didn't have a father, since he was God. Sometimes he claimed that the hospital superintendent, Dr. Yoder, was his father. Leon insisted that he had no earthly father at all, saying, "Sir, my father is a white dove who became my foster father after I died the death." At another meeting, Dr. Rokeach brought up the topic of marriage. Leon, who was single, said that he had been married to the Virgin Mary for 38 years. When Dr. Rokeach asked how that was possible, since Leon was only 37, Leon stated that he was born married to her. Joseph spoke about his wife in a very matter-of-fact way, simply saying that she was a French-Canadian girl from Ontario whom he had met through a mutual friend. When asked to talk about their childhood, Clyde and Joseph both said they had fond, pleasant memories. Leon, however, often talked about how his mother would seduce him, starting at the age of 5. Yet there were other times he claimed that he had never had sexual intercourse. Although none of the men went to church, they frequently talked about religion at their meetings. They also discussed art, Christmas, hallucinations, tape recorders, and shape-shifting. It was during the second month of the research project that Dr. Rokeach changed the conditions of the daily group meetings, when he realized that all 3 men were standing firmly in their convictions that they were Jesus Christ. He felt the men were making very little headway. Up to this point, Dr. Rokeach had been the one steering the sessions, picking the topics, guiding the discussions, focusing on the issue of identity. This had allowed him to obtain more information about the men, info about their backgrounds, characters, attitudes towards life, and how they reacted to things. But now there was little to gain by keeping things the same. Dr. Rokeach's new plan was to let Clyde, Joseph, and Leon control the sessions, to a point. Each of them would take turns being the daily chairman. It would be the chairman's responsibility to call the men together for meetings and choose a discussion topic. The chairman would sit in a special designated seat and could pass out ready-made cigarettes that were supplied by the research team. Dr. Rokeach was hoping to encourage cooperation and foster a friendly interaction between them, given how withdrawn they typically were. How would this change affect the group dynamic? What topics would they talk about? What ones would they avoid? Joseph seemed to be the most excited of the 3 of them when it came to the new chairman system, while Leon said that Truth was the chairman. Clyde nominated the research assistant. In the end, they appointed Joseph. He chose Crusading for Peace as their discussion topic, and while the men didn't always agree, they remained friendly. The next day, Leon was made chairman, and the group discussed communism, socialism, movies, capitalism, and government, all topics that Clyde had difficulty contributing to. And to Dr. Rokeach's surprise, Leon apologized for this, saying he didn't mean to make Clyde feel left out. The following day was Clyde's turn to be chairman, although it was something he didn't want, saying that he wasn't used to holding office, and that he would rather talk when he felt like it. Despite this, he called the men together for their meeting and managed to somewhat guide the entire session. Interestingly enough, when it came time for Joseph to be chairman again, he approached 2 other patients, not Leon and Clyde, and informed them it was time for the meeting. Then he approached a 3rd patient and asked them to come along too. Action that, to Dr. Rokeach, indicated extreme confusion on Joseph's part. When Joseph was asked why he rounded up the other patients, he replied that it was just an intuition. He never did anything like that again. From that point on, the rotating chairman became a well-established routine, and a title that each of them fiercely guarded, allowing no deviation from the schedule. In mid-December of 1959, 6 months after the experiment started, Leon received news that his mother had passed, to which Leon responded, "I have no mother." It was noted that Leon showed no visible reaction to the news. He wasn't sad about it, didn't want to go to her funeral, and didn't want the day off from laundry duty. However, later that evening, something curious happened. At their group meeting, Leon insisted, in front of Joseph, that Joseph had died, and the body attending the meeting was basically just a Joseph lookalike. When asked if it was plausible that Leon was getting 2 different people confused, Leon denied the possibility. Dr. Rokeach and his team made note that despite Leon looking calm earlier in the day, he now looked like he was in pain and seemed to have aged 10 years since that morning. As 1959 came to an end, Dr. Rokeach and his team noticed increased camaraderie between the men. At some point, Joseph began bringing a large atlas to the meetings, to which he and Leon spent a great deal of time looking over. The 2 were often huddled together over the maps looking up various countries. And while the 2 did very little talking to one another, the research team felt like positive progress was being made, considering they were comfortable being physically close and appeared to be working toward a common goal. During another meeting, Leon got up to light Clyde's pipe on 3 separate occasions. Leon complimented Joseph's ability to read French and even began calling him Joey. The men took turns reading poetry and plays while the other two heartily applauded, ending their meetings with compliments like, "We had a good poetry reading tonight." After 7 weeks of chaired meetings, the research team convinced the men to start meeting on the weekends without them, even getting them to submit reports on how things went. Here's one from November 8, 1959. Open session of discussion with second verse of My Country America 'Tis of Thee at 9:30 a.m. Closed session, 10:30 a.m. Discussed item of 4 bestsellers for 99-cent double-day $1 book club. Discussed about orange juice in This Week Magazine Detroit News. Discussed item about a new drug called Ergo. A rye fungus, technical term LSD, sometimes used against alcoholism, and aid to enter into gray shadows of part subconscious engram brain flow to aid in self-psychoanalysis with technical aid. According to item, best cure is will to help oneself, and LSD is only a means to an end, not a cure-all. Read about item called We're Looking for People Who Like to Draw from a magazine section of Detroit News. Complete information according to instrumental divine habeas corpus cosmic parchment in front of the face, and in front of this parchment of paper. Closed meeting singing fourth verse of America. In giving the men more control over the meetings, Dr. Rokeach noticed a big shift in how they viewed the sessions, each other, and even Dr. Rokeach. Joseph was now pushing for 2 meetings a day, or at the very least extending their 3:31. He also remarked on how Leon no longer detested his company, and commented that he and Clyde were getting along nicely. Clyde said he was getting along with both Joseph and Leon. He also noticed that Leon wasn't as cranky. When Rokeach asked Clyde if the others were still claiming to be God, he said, "No, not so much." Leon said he was satisfied with the new chairman's system, and Dr. Rokeach noticed that Leon seemed to be less self-centered and more concerned for others, even changing his attitude toward Dr. Rokeach, saying the doctor was now more neutral and not so negative. There were even occasions when Leon showed concern over Dr. Rokeach, telling him to drive careful if the weather was bad. Dr. Rokeach noted that after he put the men in charge of the meetings, the issue of identity changed. If one of the men did mention in passing that they were God, the other simply ignored it or changed the subject. They no longer wanted to argue about it. Leon would offer his typical response of, "That's your belief, sir," and then move on. It appeared that once the men formed friendships with one another and bonded, they were no longer interested in fighting about who was really God. Instead, they asserted their identities in different ways, typically out of earshot of each other. For example, if Joseph claimed to be God during a meeting, Leon would get out of his chair and go whisper in the research assistant's ear that Joseph was really just an instrument of God. During another meeting, Joseph asked if he could give a speech into the tape recorder. Then, with his back to Leon and Clyde, he shouted, "This is me, God!" The men also began talking about how they were God in written messages to others. To Dr. Rokeach, it appeared that handing over control to the men made them act far less delusional as a whole. In fact, they spent a majority of the meetings either reading or sitting in silence. And then Leon began talking about new delusions, calling them announcements or news items. Over time, Dr. Rokeach began to believe that this was to reduce rather than increase the possibility of conflicts between the men. To him, he felt that the men were trying to avoid conflict altogether in order to keep their group. In January of 1960, Dr. Rokeach arranged for the men to be moved from Ward D23 to Ward D16. This move made it possible for them to spend more time alone together. Their new quarters had a private sitting/dining room, which the men all loved. They felt it was peaceful and more private. During the first few weeks, Leon and Joseph cleaned the room daily. It was where they chose to spend most of their time, though they still spoke very little. Clyde, on the other hand, used their private room for meals and meetings only, choosing to spend the rest of his time wandering around or sitting in the day room. It was around this time that Leon announced he would be going by a different name. He wanted everyone, including the doctors, nurses, aides, and other patients, to call him Dung. Now, for the sake of this video, I'll still be referring to him as Leon, but it's interesting to note that along with the name change came a change in his behavior. Leon now spent more time in the bathroom and frequently had to be pulled from them in order to attend their meetings. He even began writing the weekend reports on toilet paper. Later, Dr. Rokeach interviewed Clyde in private about his thoughts on Leon's new name. Clyde said, "I don't like it. Dung is a dirty word." Dr. Rokeach asked, "Does Leon still say he's Jesus Christ?" Clyde said, "I don't know, but he couldn't be that anyway. There can't be more than one." Dr. Rokeach asked, "Where is the one?" Clyde said, "Right here. Are you glad or sorry that Leon isn't saying he's Jesus Christ anymore?" Clyde said, "Doesn't matter to me. I don't call him anything now because I don't like to say that word." By February, Leon was telling everyone that he had 3 God-given names: Dung, Rex Rexarium, and Jesus Christ, and that going forward, he would be the most humble creature on the face of the earth. Dr. Rokeach believed that Leon's new name didn't exactly mean a change in identity. Rather, it signified a rearrangement in his belief system. By making himself vulnerable, it allowed him to cope better in social situations. Kind of like how a person might make fun of themselves in order to take away that ability or power from another person. A wildly successful tactic that Eminem has used throughout his career. The time from implementing the rotating chair until January of 1960 had been a time of relative growth and peace. The men were cooperative and friendly with one another, less withdrawn, and more in contact with reality, at least according to Dr. Rokeach. To him, this meant the men, especially Leon, were getting better. Rokeach theorized, however, that Leon didn't want to get better, though that's a theory I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think it's that simple, that a person with a mental illness can simply choose to get better, choose to stay sick. Dr. Rokeach believed that Leon wanted companionship to a point, but the notion of getting better scared him. He began caring too much about Joseph and Clyde and felt the need to return to a previous state of isolation. During their meeting on February 18th, Dr. Rokeach wanted to see how the men would react to him referring to them as Mr. Dung, Mr. God, and Mr. Christ. Surprisingly, all 3 of them responded negatively. Rokeach felt this demonstrated that each of them had more of a grasp on reality than they'd like to admit, that they understood the social implications of going by those names. Clyde said it was because he didn't want others laughing at him. During their April 22nd meeting, in hopes of bringing the men closer together, the team issued them a ground pass that would allow free access to the hospital grounds and patient store. The only caveat was that the card would be issued in all 3 of their names, and they had to use it together. Something the men didn't take too kindly to, with Joseph saying, "Peeling potatoes is bad enough, but I should be able to go out on my own." They declined the pass. They also declined it during their April 25th meeting. The men were standing firm in that they wanted to go out alone. They were individuals and therefore wanted individual ground cards or nothing at all. On May 5th, the men were issued 3 individual cards, and while Dr. Rokeach and his team had hoped that they would hang out together, once outside, the men went their separate ways. On May 25th, the men were appointed to the Flora and Fauna Commission and were tasked with mapping out the flora and fauna on the hospital grounds, something Leon and Joseph were excited about. Clyde, not so much. He said he'd rather take care of the group's money. Since giving the men their ground passes and appointing them to the Flora and Fauna Commission, Dr. Rokeach noticed positive changes in Leon's demeanor. He was cheerful and appeared more relaxed. Joseph, however, was worried he wouldn't do a good job. Then, towards the end of May, Leon announces that he would be collecting flora and fauna specimens via cosmic photographs, using a cosmic camera. He showed the group several pieces of blank paper that were labeled Elm Tree, to which Joseph said, "There's nothing real about it," and stated that he no longer wanted to work with Leon. Anytime the staff recommended different ways of collecting specimens, the men, while enthusiastic about it, wouldn't cooperate with one another or work together. Begging the question, were they unable to work together because they had schizophrenia, or was it due to their feelings and attitudes towards each other? Dr. Rokeach and his team felt that the Flora and Fauna Commission had been a flop. It hadn't succeeded in bringing the men closer together, believing that Leon was at the heart of the issue, as he was more or less the leader of the group and often took control. The other issue lied in the fact that he liked to work alone. On June 21st, Dr. Rokeach again broached the subject of their identities. When he asked which one of them was Jesus Christ, the men all replied, "I am," and began bickering. June was the last time the research team confronted the men with direct questions about their identity. They felt that while the confrontations were informative, they were too upsetting to the men and didn't want to subject them to unnecessary stress. By July of 1960, so a year into the experiments, the meetings began to stagnate. The men didn't have a lot to say. So, towards the end of the month, Dr. Rokeach announced that the meetings would now be held at 3 p.m. in Building A for those who wanted to come, and it was up to the men to get themselves there. Would the men still come to the meetings if the meetings weren't brought to them? Monday, August 1st, marked the first day for the now voluntary meetings. Dr. Rokeach believed Joseph and Clyde would attend, but wasn't so sure about Leon. However, by 3 p.m., none of the men had shown up. Individual interviews held with them on August 4th revealed that Joseph said he was sick and had been keeping to himself, while Leon was noted to be extremely depressed. With the meetings having come to a halt, Dr. Rokeach and his research team moved the experiment to the next phase. The breakdown of the Flora and Fauna Commission marked the end of the first phase of research. And while the first phase primarily dealt with the idea of confronting a person who held a specific identity with others who claimed the same one, the second stage of research set out to explore another avenue of the nature of systems of beliefs: positive and negative authority, the people we learn and gain beliefs from. Usually, a person's first authority is their mother, then later their father. At some point, a person's authority base will grow to include more and more people who can be quote-unquote counted on to know. Think classmates, politicians, religious groups. Dr. Rokeach hypothesized that a normal person will change their beliefs or behavior whenever suggestions for change come from a person or institution that the person accepts as a positive authority. A person will change their beliefs or behavior so that they conform with what they believe the positive authority expects from them. However, if they cannot or will not change, the person will alter their beliefs about the authority itself, thus viewing the authority in a more negative light. So, how could this theory be applied to the three Christs? Well, it was long thought by psychiatrists that severely regressed paranoid people had no external positive reference people or groups, which was why they were so hard to treat. Dr. Rokeach was of the belief that those with paranoid schizophrenia had delusional beliefs that were unshakable because they didn't share them or communicate them with others. They knew that no one in the, quote, real world would accept their beliefs. Again, this is personally something I don't agree with. One could argue that the men have been sharing their beliefs at the meetings. According to psychoanalytic theory, in order for therapy to work and help a person, the patient needs to see the therapist in a positive way. They need to build a relationship where they trust and respect the therapist. But in psychosis, positive transference is deemed unlikely, and logical persuasion is out. It was believed that Clyde, Joseph, and Leon were missing real external positive reference sources. They did, however, have delusional positive reference. For example, Clyde frequently hallucinated about a woman named Gloria whom he spoke highly of. Now, she was a real person, someone he had gone to school with, but he hadn't seen her in years. Joseph believed that Dr. Yoder, the hospital superintendent, was his father, and Leon believed the Virgin Mary was his wife, and his uncle was the reincarnation of Michael the Archangel. Both were people he spoke highly of. Dr. Rokeach and his team wanted to see if they could somehow enlist the help of the men's delusional authorities by initiating suggestions for change through them. He did this by writing letters to the men that were from these trusted sources. Obviously, this brings up serious ethical issues that Dr. Rokeach was aware of, and he said it was something that he deeply considered before deciding to proceed. He had to take into consideration how these messages might affect the men. If you remember, it was actually due to ethical reasons that he forewent studying identity in children, choosing to instead work with psychotic individuals. When it came to the three Christs, Dr. Rokeach intended for the messages to be written in a supportive and emotionally gratifying way, in hopes that it would help above all improve the men's conditions. They actually got the idea for the letters from Leon in April of 1960, when he had mentioned that he was expecting a letter from his wife, who at the time was a delusional figment named Madame Yeti. This new undertaking would hopefully flesh out two things: if Leon actually believed in the existence of his delusional wife, and whether changes in his delusions and behavior could be brought about through suggestions coming from her rather than the research team. So, a few hours before their August 1st meeting, which, if you remember, was to be held in Building A, an aide delivered a letter to Leon that had no return address. He told Leon that a lady had approached him as he was walking onto the hospital grounds, asking him to deliver a letter to Dr. Dung in Ward D16. The letter read, "Dr. R.I. Dung, Ward D16, Ypsilanti State Hospital. My dear husband, I have been aware on Channel 1 that you have been waiting for me to visit you for a very long time. If the good Lord permits, I will visit you at the Ypsilanti State Hospital on Ward D16 on this Thursday at 1 o'clock. Sincerely, Madam R.I. Dung. Leon's initial response was one of disbelief, saying that although he had never seen his wife's handwriting, he knew there was no way she wrote it or signed that letter. Hours later, Leon was noted to be extremely depressed. On August 4th, the day Leon's wife was supposed to visit him, he went outside and didn't come back until hours after she'd initially said she'd be there. The next attempt at communication with Leon through his wife came during their August 18th meeting, when an aide came to get him, saying that he had a phone call. When he came back, he said he wasn't sure if the caller was his wife or not, telling the group that it would get straightened out. The next day, he told an aide that his wife's maiden name was Ruth, and that he was sorry he missed her August 4th visit. By August 20th, Leon seemed to be convinced that his wife was indeed contacting him, telling everyone at their meeting that he was glad his wife was interested in him. Then, on August 24th, Dr. Rokeach sent another letter. It read, Dr. R.I. Dung, Ward D16, Ypsilanti State Hospital. My dear husband, I am very glad I had the opportunity to speak to you over the telephone last week. Please accept the little gift I am enclosing, since I know by observation of Channel 1 that you need a positive cigarette holder. I think you will enjoy this one since it also has a cosmic buffer. Sincerely yours, Madam Yeti Woman. Just like with the first letter, Leon again wasn't entirely sure it came from his wife, telling the group it could be the aide playing a trick on him. 2 days later, on August 26th, Leon apologized to the aide, telling him that he saw his wife on the hospital grounds and was sorry for accusing him of trickery. At their August 27th meeting, the topic of Leon's wife came up. Dr. Rokeach tells Leon that he always believed Leon's wife was made up, but says he's at a loss to explain the phone calls and letters. When he asks to see the letters as proof, Leon tells him that he flushed them down the toilet. The research team couldn't be certain if Leon believed the messages were a hoax or not. So, on August 31st, they sent another letter. My dear husband, I am very happy to say that I will be at the hospital today, August 31st, and tomorrow. I hope that you will come to see me in the employees' store at 5:15 p.m. each day. I am looking forward to seeing you after all this time, and I hope that you will be able to recognize me. Sincerely yours, Madam Yeti Woman. Later that evening, an aide saw Leon enter the store. After wandering around as if looking for someone, he leaves and returns to Ward D16. He then asked the aide where the employee's cafeteria was, telling the aide that he was supposed to meet his wife there. The aide said Leon looked upset, but said he would see his wife tomorrow night instead. The next evening, on September 1st, Leon went to the cafeteria, where an employee, who noticed him looking around, asked if he could help. Leon said no one left. When he returned to his ward, he was visibly upset and angry, telling an aide that he saw his wife in the back of the cafeteria having sexual relations. Over the next few days, the staff noticed that Leon looked like he was under a great deal of stress, leading Dr. Rokeach to conclude that Leon did in fact believe in the existence of his wife. Leon would later work out that his wife hadn't actually committed adultery that day in the cafeteria. Since she was also God, she was just being shown love, thus showing Leon love. On September 12th, Leon receives another letter, and this one comes with its first underlying suggestion. The letter to Leon reads, My dear husband, it gives me great pleasure that you followed my wishes and enjoyed yourself at the store on Friday afternoon. I know that the meetings have become a little dull, and I think that you might enjoy them better if you would start the meeting with a new song, such as Onward Christian Soldiers or some other suitable hymn. Please request the other members of the group to join you in this new hymn. It makes me very happy to know that you are a righteous, idealed man. You will hear from me in the very near future on other matters pertaining to my plans for your well-being. Your loving wife, Madam Yeti Woman. P.S. Do not divulge the contents of this letter to anyone, please. Leon waits until it's his day to be chairman, and chooses the song his wife suggested. On September 14th, he receives another letter. This one, too, contains an ask. My dearest husband, it fills me with joy to know that you are carrying out my instructions with so much pleasure and good faith. I want to continue telling you things that will make you happy and increase your enjoyment of life. I am sending you another $1 so that you might supply yourself with much refreshments and anything else you'd want to buy. In a charitable way, you should treat Joseph and Clyde to a double cola. I will write you again at the earliest possible moment. Your loving wife, Madam Yeti Woman. Later that day, Leon asks an aide to break his dollar, then gives Clyde and Joseph each a quarter. The next letter Leon receives from his wife says that she'll be writing often, in order to bring him as much happiness as she possibly can. And this continues, with Dr. Rokeach sending Leon letters from his wife every few days, with the arching theme of making suggestions to Leon that will benefit his well-being. It was clear to the research team that their attempts to control and shape Leon's behavior through the letters had been wildly successful. He was now doing things that he had once refused to do when the idea came from them. For the first time, the team was seeing a different side of Leon. They had seen him show new emotions, tear up, and allow himself a few small pleasures. Next, Dr. Rokeach wanted to see if they could persuade him to give up his name, R.I. Dung. On September 20th, a letter was sent to Leon saying, "My dear husband, thank you very much for your sincere and truthful reactions to my last letter. I am very gratified by it, and it strengthens my desire for your well-being and redemption. You will notice that in my letters to you, I address you as my dear husband, and never as my dear Dung. To tell you the truth, I do not feel that it is quite proper for a person in my station to address a person in your station in this manner. Therefore, I will continue in the letters which follow to address you as my dear husband. I have always respected your free will in this matter, and I vow to continue to do so. But to tell you my truthful feelings, I would much prefer it if you would call yourself Domino from now on. Domino has a truthful and humble sound to it. Rex is acceptable too, and I would not object if you prefer Rex. But personally, I prefer Domino. Let me say once again, my dear husband, that no matter how you may prefer to call yourself, Domino or Rex or Dung, you will continue to be my dear husband, and that first and foremost I will be for you 100%, even if you prefer to call yourself something other than Domino, or Rex or Dung. This will be all right. I am still for truth and for you 100%. Truthfully yours, Madam Yeti Woman." Despite the suggestion, Leon made no moves to change his name. The next few letters suggest what kind of tobacco would be best for him to buy, changing the brand from letter to letter. Then, in late September, Leon stopped accepting letters, and the team wasn't sure why. Had they moved too quickly? Was it because they suggested the name change? Perhaps it was the money. They also wondered if it had anything to do with the ward's new resident psychiatrist, Dr. Broadhurst, who happened to be young and attractive. Leon had started to suspect that she was the one writing him the letters. Whatever the reason, the research team would never know. The experiment did, however, give them insight into suggestions that were made from a positive reference person. At first, Leon accepted the suggestions and followed them. Then he started resisting them. Leon began seeing his wife in a different light. At first, she had been nothing but positive. But then Leon began splitting her. For instance, she started off as female, then became both male and female, sane and insane, positive and negative. Dr. Rokeach theorized that this allowed Leon to reject any suggestions he didn't want to accept, attributing them to a negative reference. Because Leon wasn't willing to follow the suggestions, this meant his attitude about his wife changed. The research team had unintentionally destroyed Leon's positive reference person. They wondered if there was anything they could do to restore her positive standing in Leon's life. For the time being, however, the team would start using Leon's other positive reference, his uncle. On September 29th, an aide informed Leon that he had a long-distance call from a man waiting for him. The man on the other end introduced himself as his Uncle George, telling Leon that he's been in touch with his wife and that they were both working for his redemption. He told Leon that he needed to stop saying that his wife was insane, to which Leon cut him off and hung up on him. After this, the research team decided to halt all attempts at changing Leon's view of his wife. In October, a change was made to the research team. The assistant, Mr. Spivak, would now be replaced with a woman named Miss Anderson. Dr. Rokeach felt that Leon had unresolved issues about women in general. Issues made evident in the way that Leon talked about his mother, his delusional foster moms and wives, and even the way he viewed the other female patients as trying to seduce him. Perhaps he could help resolve Leon's attitude towards women by bringing on a dedicated, caring, and compassionate female assistant. The news of the change was announced through a letter to Leon from his uncle. It read, "I shall overlook the fact that you hung up on me because you were not sure about my voice. Yes, it was me all right, and I'm taking this means of finishing my conversation which I started with you by phone. In addition to the things I told you on the telephone, I am using this letter to let you know also that a change is going to take place around the hospital. Mr. Mark Spivak, psychologist, is going to leave this hospital to go somewhere else. He will be replaced by another psychologist very shortly. I am sure that you will find that the new psychologist will be for you positively all the time." This was the last letter that Leon would ever accept from his uncle or his wife. But what Leon couldn't know was that these letters would shape not only the relationship he would establish with Miss Anderson, but also his delusional beliefs. Miss Anderson was introduced to the men during their October 3rd meeting. On October 7th, Leon broached the subject of sex and human nature. During their October 10th meeting, Leon talked about his changing views of Miss Anderson, Dr. Broadhurst, his wife, mother, father, and the Virgin Mary, the main thing being bisexuality. Madame Yeti was no longer his wife. In fact, his current wife was now a bisexual creature called Ruth, God, and Lourdes. He now believed Miss Anderson to be bisexual, and Dr. Broadhurst was currently in the he stage of life, kind of like how Madame Yeti eventually became male and female. It became clear early on that Leon was attracted to Miss Anderson. That's why when he began wearing a blindfold and earplugs, they theorized it was so that he could disguise and possibly deny himself his affection for her. During the 3 weeks that he wore the blindfold and earplugs, he acted as if Miss Anderson didn't exist. Over the next 6 months, his attitude towards her fluctuated, going from seeking her out to avoiding her, expressing his love and need for her to denying it. Starting in mid-October and continuing for several months, Leon began writing Miss Anderson letters and asking her to stay for private post-meeting discussions with him. By the end of October, the team felt that she was becoming a real, external, positive reference person for Leon. He once again looked forward to their daily group meetings, if for no other reason than seeing Miss Anderson. And he went to great lengths to cut the meeting short in order to have more one-on-one time with her. During this time, the team noticed positive changes in Leon's behavior. He was now taking part in evening snacks, something he normally didn't do. And he was more social with the other patients. He even began singing in the showers. Despite Leon's fondness for Miss Anderson, there were times that he was hostile towards her. He began to identify her with his mother, even going as far as to call her mom. One day he said that he and Miss Anderson were one person, and that he had to breathe and eat for her. Another time he claimed that she tortured him for over 30 years. To Dr. Rokeach, it was clear that Leon felt torn when it came to his relationship with Miss Anderson. He felt that Leon struggled with receiving time, devotion, and reassurance from her, with his guilt over his sexual attraction. Rokeach also theorized that Leon was fearful of becoming too dependent on her, and that, like his mother, Miss Anderson might try to stifle and control him. He felt that Leon went to great lengths to keep his relationship with her within strict bounds. This meant that if one session between them went well and was warm, they could expect that the next one would be characterized by either hostility or withdrawal. The team began to notice another pattern in Leon's moods. Miss Anderson worked at the hospital Monday through Friday and was gone on the weekends. On Mondays, they noticed that Leon sulked and was withdrawn. But as the week progressed, he gradually warmed up. Until Friday, Miss Anderson's last day of work for the week. Leon interpreted her being away from the hospital on weekends as abandonment, proof that he couldn't count on her, and that she didn't really care about him. It was in June of 1961, when Miss Anderson went on vacation for a week, that Leon completely severed his relationship with her. Now, during this time, Joseph was also receiving letters from his quote-unquote father, Dr. Yoder, the hospital superintendent. Remember, it was actually Dr. Rokeach writing them. The purpose of these letters were similar to Leon's, to see if they could enact change in Joseph using his delusional, albeit positive authority person. Unlike Leon, Joseph actually wrote back, and while his letters were complicated, they did provide insight into Joseph's character and the identity problems that he faced daily. Their first exchange happened in mid-July of 1960, and even though no other letters were sent for the next 3 months, the impact of that initial exchange on Joseph was profound. The team noticed that he had fewer delusions, and he was now more realistic about his life. For instance, he stopped claiming he was born in England, and when asked about his birthplace, he told them Quebec. When asked what kind of jobs he was qualified to take if he left the hospital, Joseph no longer gave outlandish answers. Instead, he said he would take work as a janitor or clerk. It was a full 3 months after initially receiving his letter from Dr. Yoder before Joseph began to show signs of slipping back into delusion. Dr. Rokeach began sending letters to Joseph again on October 24th. In that letter, he, as Dr. Yoder, praises Joseph for no longer talking about being deported back to England, saying, "Keep up the good work. The more realistic you get, the better you are. The better you are, the sooner I'll be able to consider sending you home to Detroit. You have been here for a long time, and I would like nothing better than to send you back home to Detroit as soon as possible. That is, as soon as you are well. Have you been to church lately? If you haven't, why not go next Sunday? It might do you good, you know. Remember how good you felt the last time you went to church?" Now, this letter seemed to upset Joseph, telling the others, "He doesn't want me to go to England. He has nothing to do with the discharge. Social services takes care of these things. He's just a figurehead, that's all he is. I've always been better mentally. I entered the hospital voluntarily. Just a letter of insult, that's all. That's my business if I go to church. The next thing will be a letter saying, 'Joseph Castle, you didn't answer my letter, so I didn't send you home.' Just a letter of diatribe, of insults." Despite Joseph's upset over Dr. Yoder's letter, he eventually wrote him back, and a slew of correspondences ensues. Most of the letters encourage Joseph to go to church, and he complies. By November 20th, Joseph was attending services 2 to 3 times a week. In some of Joseph's letters to Dr. Yoder, he makes requests. For instance, he asked to be excused from his job working in the vegetable room. In another letter, he asked for medicine, all of which Dr. Yoder grants him. Then towards the end of January, he asked to be moved to a different ward, saying that the ward he was currently in was too small, and that he wanted to be separated from Clyde and Leon, saying, "Moreover, I want to separate from the other 2 fellows who attend the meetings with me. Their psychology is tremendously bad towards me, thus a bad feeling and sickness." In Dr. Yoder's February 24th letter, he denies Joseph's ward transfer request, saying that it was better for him to stay where he was, something that Joseph was fine with since he started becoming anxious over the thought of transferring wards. On February 26th, Joseph asked Dr. Yoder for a job as a writer. However, when Dr. Yoder wrote back telling him he had the freedom to write and suggested he write either a short story, an article, a novel, or autobiography, and to let him know what he needed, Joseph presented roadblock after roadblock, saying that he didn't have a good library, was too busy with his new cleaning job, needed a publisher first, required more office space, wanted money for supplies, needed a secretary, and on and on. Then, on March 31st, Joseph did something that caught the research team off guard. On March 31st, Joseph wrote a letter to President Kennedy, asking him for a job in Washington. He then asked him to contact Dr. Yoder and request his release from the hospital. Not only that, he told President Kennedy that he heard voices telling him that President Kennedy was his father. The research team believed this represented a clear change in Joseph's delusional system. Did this mean that he believed Dr. Yoder was no longer his father? They weren't sure, but Joseph continued addressing him as Dear Dad in his letters. The team felt that Joseph was now in a double bind. He had to either change his behavior to comply with the suggestions being made by a positive authority, or he had to change his attitude towards that authority. The same thing happened with Leon when he had to choose between Madame Yeti's suggestion or changing his attitude towards her altogether. Dr. Rokeach believed the catalyst for Joseph came when Dr. Yoder suggested he do some writing, something that Joseph may have subconsciously been afraid of failing at. In Joseph's mind, he resolved that conflict by writing to President Kennedy. In fact, Dr. Rokeach believed that both Joseph and Leon solved their problems of not carrying out certain suggestions made by their positive reference by substituting them out for other people. From their data, the team concluded that while Joseph was willing to comply with suggestions made by positive authority, he was only willing to do so as long as it didn't require a major change in his belief system. With the research project coming to an end, the team began the process of slowly terminating their work with Joseph, Clyde, and Leon in order to prepare them for their eventual departure. Letters from Dr. Yoder began to slow. In response to this change, Joseph began writing extremely long reports of their weekend meetings, including an extensive record of every book in the hospital library and store, telling Dr. Rokeach that he made the switch from writing long letters to Dr. Yoder to writing long reports. He was also extremely concerned about how they would conduct the future meetings without them. He wondered who would keep the meetings going, who would write the reports. When the team did announce their imminent departure, they had been purposely vague about what would happen once they were gone. Dr. Rokeach hoped to receive updates from the hospital staff on what the men decided to do with their time. On August 15, 1961, 2 years and 1.5 months after starting the experiment, the team said goodbye to Clyde, Joseph, and Leon. During that time, they collected information about the men's early lives, their characters, their attitude towards them and others, and their day-to-day lives living in a mental hospital. They believed the data they collected was relevant to schizophrenia, the issue of identity, the nature of authority in those with mental illness, and the role of religion as it pertains to mental health and mental illness. But most importantly was the information they gained from observing the reactions of each of the 3 men when confronted with others who claimed the same identity. They also felt they learned a great deal from Joseph and Leon in how they reacted to communication involving people who were a part of their delusional systems. So, what can be learned from this experiment? What, if any, implications does it have for people in general? Dr. Rokeach was of the belief that psychiatric literature was pointing more and more to the idea that many forms of mental illness were the result of disturbances in one's sense of identity, pointing to those with amnesia and multiple personalities, now known as dissociative identity disorder. Harvard psychologist Robert White described it by saying, "Whether we are dealing with a brief amnesia, a more extended fugue, or a fully developed double or multiple personality, the central feature of the disorder is a loss of personal identity. The patient forgets who he is and where he is. He loses the symbols of identity and also the memories of his previous life that support a continuing sense of selfhood." In looking at schizophrenia, it's been shown over and over to significantly impact a person's identity and sense of self. But issues of identity aren't just seen in those with mental illness. I think we all struggle with the theme of identity and trying to figure out who we are at the different stages in our lives. Is it any wonder why a person, for whatever reason, would forego their own identity and adopt that of someone who was well-known and larger than life? Dr. Rokeach pointed to a quote from British philosopher Bertrand Russell. "Every man would like to be God, if it were possible. Some few find it difficult to admit the impossibility." Asking the 3 Christs to confront their identities didn't heal them or rid them of their diagnoses. Likewise, having them confront themselves and each other didn't cause radical changes in their fundamental beliefs or delusional systems. Dr. Rokeach theorized that they developed their delusions for good reasons, and those reasons didn't change as a result of confrontation. Even though having the men confront their identities didn't cause them to change who they were or what they believed, it was clear that the confrontations were upsetting and threatening to them. They understood that realistically, only one person could have a given identity. That's why Joseph constantly said, "There's only one God," and why Clyde would say, "I'm the only one." To deal with this, the men had to create a host of defense mechanisms. That's where we saw denial, withdrawal, and avoidance come into play. When it came to Leon, Dr. Rokeach believed that he changed his beliefs whenever it helped him cope with his perception of reality, and that he was constantly in conflict with himself. He wanted to remain in the group to satisfy his need for companionship and relieve his boredom. He needed to find ways to avoid conflict over the identity issue, and he needed to remain mentally ill, with the reason for him becoming sick still existing. Despite wanting companionship, Dr. Rokeach believed that Leon had a need to remain isolated from his peers. He also struggled with his sexuality, needing to defend himself while also satisfying his urges, something that caused him a great deal of guilt. Degrading himself helped him atone for his sexual feelings and urges. Dr. Rokeach also believed that Leon was lacking a healthy mother figure, and subconsciously or not, he obsessed over wanting a mother who was protective, loving, and wouldn't abandon him. Rokeach pointed to the fact that he was raised by a woman who was struggling with her own mental health, and who seemingly chose church over her children. We saw this conflict play out in the women in Leon's lives, from the Virgin Mary to Madame Yeti to Dr. Broadhurst to Miss Anderson. When we look at Joseph's relationships with his parents, not a whole lot is known. Joseph found it difficult to talk about them. We can, however, glean some insight from the fact that Joseph claimed to have multiple fathers. He had his biological father, then there was Dr. Yoder, and eventually President Kennedy. Dr. Rokeach wanted to explore schizophrenia and how 3 people could actively discard their identities in exchange for one that was larger than life. Freud claimed that paranoid delusions of grandeur were a result of repressed homosexuality. And while Dr. Rokeach didn't necessarily agree with Freud's view, he was in the camp of psychiatrist Norman Cameron, Silvano Arietti, and Edith Weigert, who suggested that paranoid delusions were a result of confusion over their sexual identity. Rokeach felt that Joseph, Clyde, and Leon all suffered from uncertainty about their role as men. Rokeach presented his study as exploratory and cautioned that his findings needed to be interpreted with discretion. After all, his sample size was small, and he knew it was biased. The team couldn't assess the effects of things like age, heredity, environment, and length of hospitalization. They also weren't sure what effect, if any, their presence had on the men. They felt that Clyde, who was the oldest, showed the least amount of change throughout the experiment, while Leon, the youngest, changed the most, giving weight to the theory that as a patient gets older, the chances of them responding to social stimulation decreases. There's less of an ego to work with, and not as much of a need to appear rational. Years after the experiment, Dr. Rokeach's view on it changed. He said, "While I had failed to cure the three Christs of their delusions, they had succeeded in curing me of mine, of my godlike delusion that I could change them by omnipotently and omnisciently arrange and rearrange their daily lives within the framework of a total institution." While I surely had learned a great deal about the delusional belief systems of the three Christs and why they behaved as they did, I had increasing doubts that bringing them together for the purpose of challenging and contradicting one another's beliefs was a good way to bring about lasting changes. Perhaps one of the greatest takeaways that can be gleaned from this experiment is that while three men were locked into the ultimate contradiction, they still preferred to find ways to live in peace together rather than destroy one another. Perhaps what the men were striving for wasn't so different from what many of us strive for. Rokeach said, "They were striving for goodness and greatness, and such strivings, I came to understand, are really the strivings of all human beings. The main difference being the three of them and the rest of us, who are also trying to be godlike, is that whereas the rest of us can bring ourselves to admit the impossibility of our ever becoming absolute or infinitely moral and competent, the three Christs found it difficult to admit such an impossibility." Researching this was such a roller coaster of emotions. I found myself laughing with them, crying, being confused and disgusted. When the experiments and the meetings ended, I became worried about the men and what they would do. They had spent the last 2 years attending almost daily meetings together, and then very suddenly were just dropped back into daily life. I kept wondering how they would cope. I know that Clyde Benson was discharged from the hospital in the 1970s and went on to live with his family. But other than that, I don't know much about the other two. I know that I've given you a lot to unpack today, but I cannot wait to hear from you. Had you heard about the three Christs of Ypsilanti before today's video? What did you think about the experiment itself? If you enjoyed today's video, give it a thumbs up, and hey, while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on the next investigation.